Ladies and gentlemen, I mentioned to you earlier that you should let yourself be inspired. I honestly can't think of anything that was more inspiring than those two brave Democrats from Venezuela standing up to that dictatorship and continuing to struggle. This is what we at the Inter-American Dialogue support. This is the democracy across the hemisphere that you support. And since I was only asked to do this about 5 hours ago, I'm going to improvise, so don't worry, Rebecca. As I came in, I saw several folks who I recognized as Venezuelan citizens. If you are here tonight and you are a Venezuelan citizen, Miguel Pizarro, I know I saw you, I think I saw one or two others. Let me ask you to stand right now. Todos los venezolanos, venezolanas que están con nosotros, presente. Gracias de todo corazón por el ejemplo, por su compromiso con la democracia. David, veo algunos otros. Tara, thank you so very much. We appreciate it. Okay, now it's my privilege to introduce a former boss. He's a guy who's had so many introductions done about him. You all know him. He's one of those people that, like Pelé, like Shakira, you only get one name. Tom. We all know who Tom is. When I went to work for Tom Shannon, the second or third, or maybe it was the fourth time. Actually, I should probably get everybody in this room who's ever worked for Tom Shannon to stand, and it'd be about half the room. But when I went to work, actually for Roberta Jacobson, and Tom Shannon had just left to go to Brazil to be the ambassador. Roberta and I were sitting there, and we had just taken the office in Western Hemisphere Affairs over at the State Department, and we were looking like, well, all right, I guess this is going to start. And Roberta looks over at me, and she says, I wish I had one of those little bracelets that says WWJD. What would Jesus do? But I would change it, and I would have it WWTD. What would Tom do? Because that was always how we began to solve problems. Ladies and gentlemen, you know him, you love him, you can't live without him, Tom Shannon.
Good evening to all. After John's introduction, I'm not sure I should be speaking at all. But I'm very, very grateful for all of you being here today, along with Laura Chinchilla, the other co-chair of the board of the Inter-American Dialogue. This gala is a yearly event that allows us to recognize extraordinary individuals in our hemisphere, to cheer on the work of the dialogue, especially at a moment in which we're trying to build a better hemisphere and a better world. We've just seen a remarkable video presentation by two remarkable individuals. And part of what we are faced with now is trying to understand what comes next, how to ensure that in Venezuela and elsewhere, the will of the people is respected, and we can have peaceful alternation of power and peaceful passage of power as countries attempt to build not just governments that are democratic, but societies that are democratic. Originally, the Secretary General of the OAS, Luis Almagro, was going to be with us tonight, but again, like hurricanes, other events have gotten in the way of that, and we're sorry for it because it would have been a wonderful opportunity to hear from him, but also to recognize the work the OAS has done over time and to thank them for offering this extraordinary venue for tonight's event. As I was discussing with some of my friends and colleagues in the exterior passage with all the different statues of liberators and heroes from around the Americas, having walked up the steps alongside the patio, which is a recognition of the indigenous heritage of our hemisphere. It reminded me that this is a kind of temple to Pan-American and inter-American thought and action. that was built in the early 20th century, largely with the money of Andrew Carnegie. And I noted to some that Andrew Carnegie was sufficiently humble that he chose not to have a plaque or any recognition that he had played a role in financing the building of this wonderful headquarters, but that the workmen who worked here were unprepared to comply with his desire. And so if you were to go into the next room on the side here, you'll notice in the friezes in the ceilings the initials AC that were put up there by workmen in acknowledgement of the role that Andrew Carnegie played. And it's curiously enough that workmen, who probably were not unionized, were acknowledging a steel magnate of extraordinary wealth. But it is an indication of a recognition that this was a special place, and that for us to have the gala here today is a wonderful opportunity. Now, you'll have to forgive me for a second because I realize that we're between you and the main course. And if you haven't eaten your salad yet, I really suggest you start. But I need to ask the president and CEO of the Inter-American Dialogue whether or not we're going to start with our conversation now or allow people to eat. We're going to go with the conversation. Okay, well listen, my suggestion is that people eat and keep eating while we start with a larger conversation with two extraordinary individuals, two former presidents, Michelle Bachelet of Chile and Laura Chinchilla of Costa Rica, who you have their biographies in the pamphlet that is at your tables, but they have led extraordinarily rich and important political lives and personal lives and have achieved and accomplished extraordinary things for their countries and for our hemisphere. Michelle Bachelet was president of Chile twice, the first woman president of Chile, but who also served as Minister of National Defense and Minister of Health during a long career, but also within the UN system was the Executive Director of UN Women, and then finally the High Commissioner, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. She has an extraordinary career of accomplishments both at the national level and at the international level. And Laura Chinchilla, who as I mentioned is co-chair of the Inter-American Dialogue Board with me, was Costa Rica's first woman president, but also served as Vice President of Costa Rica, as Minister of Justice, and as Minister of Public Security. She was never called the Iron Lady, but I can tell you she's a tough customer. But aside from her work in Costa Rica, she's had an extraordinary career working within a variety of international organizations and entities related to the Americas and beyond, and spent most of Paris at the Olympics, where she was also very involved in events there. So I would like to call both of them up to the stage now because we're going to have a short conversation before we carry on with the dinner tonight. So Presidents Bachelet and Chinchilla, please present yourselves. Well, we're very grateful for your presence here today and very grateful for your willingness to have this conversation. As John Feely noted, today is the 100th anniversary of Jimmy Carter's birth. And it's important for us to recognize the extraordinary contribution he made, not only to shifting American policy and approach in Latin America, but also to a broader American commitment to human rights. Today is also the inauguration of Mexico's first woman president. So it's a time of important and dramatic change. But as we've seen in the video that we just saw from Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez, This was a heartfelt plea from two important political leaders calling for the world to defend the will of the Venezuelan people, as expressed in the July 28th elections. This is a call that resonates throughout our hemisphere. And although there has been a shared understanding of what happened on July 28th, this has not led to a common approach or collective action. So my question to you both, and President Bachelet, will start with you, and then go to President Chinchilla, is what can be done in our hemisphere to ensure that the sovereign will of our peoples, as expressed through their votes, is respected?
Thanks, Tom. First of all, I would like to thank the Inter-American Dialogue for this invitation, and also because I think it's a very important event to acknowledge people and organizations who promote and defend democracy, particularly in times where we have seen democracies backsliding, not only in the region, but also in other regions. So I think it's really important to acknowledge their efforts and their work on this regard. Yes, it's been very touching to hear to Maria Corina and to Edmundo Gonzalez, but I would like to say that how can we ensure that people through their votes can really transform the situation in the countries? First of all, I have to say that democracy is not only about voting. Democracy is much more on that, much more on values and rule of law and freedoms, etc. And the problem is that we have to ensure how democracy, a democratic elected government, can really ensure to have a strong institutions architecture with independent institutions that can really ensure that those votes can be acknowledged and can be recognized. Because if you are an authoritarian and you appoint your people in the electoral system, in the Supreme Court, in all the different institutions, there will be no way to ensure that there will be a capacity of people to express their vote and mean something. So I think the challenge to be sure is, first of all, to ensure that democratic leaders, democratic governments are really democratic. One of the things in our region in the past is that democracy died when there were coup d'etat. We don't see that anymore. We see in many places in the region people who are elected democratically, and I'm not talking about the last election in Venezuela because we all know what happened there, but in other parts. But when they arrive into power, they start eroding democratic institutions. They start closing or taking out judges, etc., etc. So that's why I say now democracy is in risk because of the eruption of forces that are trying to be elected democratically, but then erode institutions. So what I think we need is leaders that can be responsive, that can be responsible, that can be reliable to people, but we need also to ensure that institutions can do their job. And I think it's very difficult when you're living in a country where it's not a democratic country. It's not only undemocratic leader, but also non-democratic countries, because institutions have been appointed by the finger. So it's very difficult in those places to be sure that people's decisions are taken into consideration. It might be, it's not depressive, it's realistic what I say. And we have seen it because in the case of Venezuela, I think most of us have been breaking our heads to think what can be the solutions. How can we ensure that the voting of the people can be recognized and acknowledged? And it's not an easy answer, I don't have it. We have been thinking about that with many other friends. But I think it's a very difficult situation if you don't really change the political system in terms of how it works, how it really responds to the people's dreams, desires, and needs. It's very difficult. And so that's why I think we need to work much harder in the region to ensure and strengthen democracy, but particularly strengthen democratic institutions. And we need to ensure that the work can be all together, to ensure that that can have an impact, if I would say. Otherwise, we will see what we have been seeing. Very interesting speeches, very interesting things, but nothing is happening. So we need to build stronger voices, stronger efforts, and try to think in a smart way what can work. But mainly, I believe we need to ensure that in the region, governments and leaders are really democratic, because otherwise we will have the same situation in other places as well.
President Chinchilla.
Thank you, Tom, and I totally, of course, endorse Michelle's comments. I will go probably more specific. I will be more specific about some concrete and immediate actions that I see concerning the situation of Venezuela. And well, the first thing is that we all must need to stand with the people of Venezuela and with its democratic leaders. There are no other option but doing that. Now, of course, many of us ask ourselves, well, and what else can I do? Because certainly there are many limitations to try to influence from outside. But according to my experience, not only working with the Venezuelan people for many years now, but also with the Nicaraguan people, there are at least some actions that are important to consider. The first is helping to spread the message. What we just heard from Maria Corina, from Edmundo, it is very important to replicate, and we shouldn't assume that the people in general are clear in the public opinion about what is happening there. And in the process of explaining them the need to support their cause, we have an opportunity also to remind us that if there is a very consequential action as political, as citizens, is voting, is electing the right leaders so we can avoid the situation that Venezuela is living today. The secondly is, and I think there are two immediate tasks. One is to call for the safe release of the asylum seekers who are right now at the Brazilian embassy. That is something very urgent. They are going through very, very difficult situation. And of course, also the release of the political prisoners. There are like 300 more prisoners resulting from the last political crisis. And finally, to recognize Edmundo as the elected president, or at least try to avoid other countries recognizing Maduro. And in that sense, I think there something better is happening than when we had a similar but different situation with Juan Guaidó, because now it is about 10 or 12 nations which are the ones recognizing Maduro as a president of Venezuela, and that is good. It means also, and this is my final comment, that we should continue encouraging nations, international organizations, the private sector, which is very important. And it was very discouraging to see, for example, Exxon, amid this crisis, Exxon telling the United States government that they will continue working with the Venezuelan government. So the private sector is really critical in these kind of occasions. They all must come together to try to adopt effective measures to continue pressuring the regime. But of course, economic and political sanctions cannot do the work by themselves. And that is, according to my criteria, an error that has been made in the past. We need economic sanctions, political sanctions, but a smart diplomatic strategy in place. The final goal is to try to open negotiations, to have a peaceful transition, but trying not to cross a red line, and Maria Corina has been very clear about that, and that is we will never sacrifice the vote of the people at the polls. I mean, the red line that we are not able to cross is not respecting the people's will on the last elections. But again, and let's remember, this is not only to support or acting in favor of the Venezuelan people. This is also about ourselves, because if democracy fails in Venezuela, we will continue seeing other similar situations in the rest of the region.
May I add a couple of things, Tom? Well, first of all, I agree completely with what Laura has mentioned, but I wanted to add, in my experience as High Commissioner, for example, Myanmar. I mean, what the people who were there at the streets fighting against the Tatmadaw, they felt abandoned by the international community. So I completely agree with what you said, Laura. Even though it might not get the best positive results, we have to be there. Our voices have to be added to their voices, so they know that we care for them, that we'll do as much as possible so their lives can improve and democracy can exist in the country. Because people feel abandoned, because it's about the news. There is a big news, but then happens something different, and people stop thinking about this. And I guess our friends here from Venezuela are clear on that they need the pressure. But I have to say, as Laura was mentioning, and in my experience as High Commissioner in many places, unilateral sanctions don't work. Because what happened is that the people who are in power, and particularly when you add corruption, they have the money. So the people who suffer are the people who have nothing, are the poorest one. So something that in abstract seems like a good possibility, I don't think is good, because you're hurting the people who are already been hurt. So I don't think that kind of unilateral, particularly economic sanctions, it's something that should be done. I think it would be a mistake, because it will affect the poorest.
Well, as we continue to talk and debate these issues, it's evident that the events of July 28th have created a new protagonist in Venezuela, and that is the people of Venezuela, who had an opportunity to speak through their votes and did so quite clearly. And although change oftentimes cannot be effected from afar, there's no doubt that our ability to understand, show support for, and stand by the people of Venezuela in this important moment will allow them to continue to be a protagonist as Maria Corina and Edmundo Gonzalez attempt to see if there's something that can be done to underscore the true impact of the vote on July 28th. But as we wrestle with the larger question of Venezuela, we're also facing issues related to democracy elsewhere in our hemisphere. And as you noted, President Bachelet, it is common to talk of democratic backsliding. But for me, what's striking is that we live in a world and in a hemisphere which has seen extraordinary economic and social change, accelerated by technology and globalization. And this has created a rate of change that political institutions and political leaders have not been able to keep up with. They have not been able to understand it, to explain it to their people, or to respond to it. And this has led to, as Rebecca Bill Chavez noted in her remarks, a gap between what people are expecting and what they're receiving. And this has led to declining confidence in our governments. It has generated mistrust in our societies. And it has opened space for a reemergence of populism in our hemisphere. And I believe that what is perceived as a crisis of democracy, in many instances, is really a crisis of governance. And so, President Chinchilla, I'll ask you the question of what can our democratic governments do better to deliver the goods to their peoples. What can they do to ensure that in this moment of extraordinary change, governments are actually providing the resources and the opportunities that can fundamentally and positively impact the lives of the citizens?
Michelle already mentioned, made some reflections considering democracy. We all agree that is one of the big issues we have. It is very sad to recognize that the backsliding, the democratic backsliding in Latin America is the longest and the deepest one as compared with other regions. And so why this is happening? It is true that the survival of democracy lies on the daily experiences of the people. And when we analyze what the Latin Americans are experiencing today with their governments, with the political actors, we see very negative kind of events. For example, according to the polls, about 70%, more than 70% of the Latin Americans says that their governments work for the elites and not for the people. More than 50% of the Latin Americans are saying that they feel unsafe living in their own communities. And as a consequence of this, and I could also bring other data, but as a consequence of these feelings of anger, of fear, of frustration, more than 50% of Latin Americans are saying that they wouldn't mind to have a non-democratic government if that government resolves their needs. So I think that for sure there is a problem, as you mentioned, of weak governance, and that means that we need to work in order to reform the institutions so they can deliver timely and effectively. But I will say that there is something else, Tom, and it is not only about weak governance, it is also about the need to renew the social pact, but at the same time trying to recognize that the institutions, the traditional institutions of the representative democracy must be also reformed. Today, political parties and parliaments are the less trusted institutions for the Latin Americans, so they are no longer those vehicles to aggregate the different interests in a society and to build consensus. Instead, what they are doing is polarizing their own people, or we are having more fragmentation, which is almost impossible in terms of taking decisions. So to finalize my interventions, we need, of course, to bring some reforms concerning the state institutions in order to improve the governance. But finally, we need to bring new institutions to our political systems so they can be able not only to represent the people, but to bring the people with their own voices and promote more deliberation and more direct participation of the citizens. So basically, I think those are the two big challenges that we need to face in terms of institutional reform.
Yeah, well, I agree, of course, with Laura. I think that there is something happening in our societies. What we call the subjectivities of societies have changed. We live in a world that has all the difficulties and challenges that we know. I mean, for the past 3 decades, there has been the biggest number of conflicts all over the world, more than 54 conflicts. We see terrible wars like Ukraine, like Gaza, like South Sudan, or the gang conflict in Haiti. And we need sort of a global governance that can deal with these kind of challenges. So I hope that the summit of the future can give some answer. I'm not sure, but I hope it can bring some light. I agree with Laura that we need a new social contract because people feel that their governments are not ensuring the promises they did. But the main thing, and this I follow it. I have been High Commissioner. In 2018, there were 80 countries with the people on the streets, 80 countries in the world. And they were against their governments because of lack of democracy, because of corruption, because of social and economic terrible situations. And I think governments, the elite, as you said, Laura, has been so far away from the people that people don't, there is this representative crisis of political parties, of political institutions, the justice system, etc. So what I think we need is that democracy has to deliver, as you say. That means that democratic leaders need to make their program of government trying to respond of people's needs, and exactly what, but the other thing that I have learned in life is that you never have to promise what you know you're not going to do. Because sometimes it can come economic crisis, and what you wanted to do is not possible. And you can explain to people, look, I wanted to do this, but I couldn't. But different is, and you see it many times, particularly with the eruption of populistic or authoritarian leaders, that they promise things that they know will never happen. So we need people to trust again in institutions, to trust again in leaders. That's why I was saying before that we need leaders that are responsive, responsible, and reliable. And that, I think, is a big challenge. It's a big challenge also because of what Laura was saying, this intent of polarization, fragmentation. I think we need to discuss more what's happening in our societies, to understand why people don't trust each other, why people feel that the government, because one thing, I went to Brazil a couple of months ago, and we did a discussion on these issues, and one of the women there was saying, look, it's a matter of perception. It's not a matter of reality. For example, well, in Chile, and I guess in many countries of the region, the issue is insecurity. If you go to Europe, it's migration. And sometimes when you ask the people, did you have a particular problem with insecurity, they didn't have it. But the perception is that everything is insecure makes them react in a way that there is a dissociation between reality and perception. But perception is what's moving people today. And they were saying people who has economic and political and social programs, they don't look at it, they don't recognize it, don't acknowledge it, because they feel abandoned. So there is a perception of not being considered by governments, not being respected, not being included, even though in terms of policies, it might not be true. For example, a government will build a road or will build a hospital, but people will feel that that's not what they need. So that's why I feel we need to understand all the structural problems that are there, how we strengthen democracy, but on the other hand, I think with the digital arena, with the artificial intelligence, with all this fake news, there is something with all these digital societies, with the social media, I think we need to understand better what's going on. Just to mention that when in Europe, the extreme right, far right, won lots of places, they had these huge TikTok programs where they send very simple messages that make people feel that they're talking to them. The narrative was something that they feel, and it was based in fear. Fear of migrants, fear of people that are different from them, and fear that what I have today, maybe I won't have it in the future. And I think that is linked to also to the triple planetary crisis. There is sort of lack of hope in society, particularly in young people. But also we have the other problem is that the young people has immediate answers, needs urgency, because the way they react with sound bites and so on, it's something that they need something now immediately. And I think political world has not yet understood this, does not have this kind of reaction, does not know how to speak to the young people. And we need to look at the subjectivity of society to understand better how what we are proposing to the people can really be something that people feel that we are taking into consideration their feelings, their perceptions.
Well, as we approach our dinner here, I have one more question to pose to both of you. We've had a chance to talk about finding ways to ensure that the will of the people is respected, that democratic governance prospers in the Americas, and that it deals with the extraordinary changes that we're seeing in our societies. But we're also in a world that is connected in remarkable ways, and we live in a hemisphere which is profoundly attractive to the rest of the world because of its food resources, its energy resources, its water resources, and its markets. And it's a region that has been globalizing quickly. And as the Western Hemisphere connects with the rest of the world, it underscores its indispensable role in addressing global problems. The question is, and I'll start with you, President Bachelet, how can our hemisphere coordinate its activities so that the hemisphere shapes the world instead of the world shaping the hemisphere?
Well, I think we need regional integration, but real regional integration, where we share common values, we share common objectives, that we can all feel that we are in it in a more equal way, and that where we don't leave anyone behind. I think that's something where we need, I forgot to say before, in democracy, that we need to include women. Women are essential in the development of a democratic...
As is obvious by this panel.
Yeah, but I was feeling guilty. I never mentioned it, I didn't mention it. Because for me it's really important. 50% of the world population, so it's really important. But in this case, I think we need a regional agenda that has been difficult. Because I've been in government when it was much easier government, because maybe many were alike, politically speaking, or we could work with governments that were different, but that we could share certain interests. And I think today in the region, there's a lot of fragmentation. There's not enough sense of the importance of regional integration. There's not enough importance of understanding, even a situation like migration. No country by itself is going to solve it. That we need to find ways with our neighbors, with wherever the situation is, the root causes of migration, to try to find solutions that can really work. And I think there is a tendency today in the region to solve the problems by their own. And we're working and living in global challenges that not even in the region we're going to solve, but at least we should start trying to make a common agenda that could really, really work in the main essential issues, in terms of social protection, in terms of dealing with inequalities, so people can feel that they're part of the problem, but part of the solution, in terms of, well, different. Even though one of the things that, it's really interesting in the region, particularly in Latin America and the Caribbean countries, is that there's a very little trade integration. I mean, all countries trade to other countries, but inside the Latin American, the GRULAC region, if I may say, there's very little regional trade integration. So I think there's much more things that can be done, but I think that we need a political will to understand that either Pepe Mujica will always say, look, we're small, well, not the case of the US, of course, but us, the rest. If we want our voices to be heard, we need to speak together, because otherwise we will never be heard. And I think the same happens with the Western Hemisphere towards other parts of the world. If we are able to coordinate better, to have a common voice, I'm not sure it's possible now, but I am somebody, as Desmond Tutu always said, I'm a prisoner of hope. I will never lose the possibility of giving up, because I think it's the only way to deal with things, to have a common will and a common voice to deal with the challenges that we have in front of us.
President Chinchilla, your thoughts?
Well, I will repeat some of the concepts that Michelle already mentioned. Probably the worst sin in our region is to be so divided among us, a too fragmented region. And I am not very optimistic about, foreseeing any positive change in the short term. If we were not able even to coordinate as a region during the pandemics, when we were the hardest hit region, and it was not possible even the 3 countries representing us in the G20, they were not able to speak with one voice for getting, for example, vaccines for Latin America. It has prevented many deaths. So if they were not able to do it at that time, I don't know when. So I think there is a problem of egos, too many egos governing Latin America right now, too much ideology. And when you start putting the ideology on the table, forget about, agreeing with anything else. So I will see that probably we should try something different coming from the regional financial institutions. Because when you analyze the main challenge that we have in the region, they are all, the most important was the most critical one, they are all of regional nature or even global nature: climate change, organized crime, migration. Those are the issues. So that means that we need the financial institutions to finally understand that they must change the way to finance programs in our region. If they are able to design projects according to this new set of global goods and regional goods, and try to find out the mechanisms, I think that we will be able to overcome this division, but something very important too. We could be able to overcome the short-term vision that also prevented us to move forward, because we will be able, to overcome these political cycles that also cause many damages in our region. So my approach will be, let us use the financial regional institutions as a way to put forward a regional agenda independently in a certain way of what is going to happen with the leaders that we have now in the region.
Well, thank you both very much. This has been insightful and useful to have 2 great political leaders of your stature here at the OAS, at the Inter-American Leadership Awards Gala is a huge privilege for all of us. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking them both.
Tom Shannon, President Bachelet, President Chinchilla, thank you for an absolutely stimulating and wonderful conversation. All right, we are actually running pretty close to time, which is a good thing, right, boss? All right, so we will take about a 25-minute break for dinner, and we'll be back here as close to 9 o'clock as we can figure out. Thanks very much.